Alrighty. There's the light switches here. There we go. Okay. It's very just echoey in this room. Okay. All right, welcome back. So 3:15. So we're gonna start in on the content today. So we'll start talking a little bit about research. Before I do that, I do have a couple of very quick points that I wanted to cover. So first, because I had made a mistake on the syllabus on day one, I have amended things a little bit. So just wanted to point out a couple of things, right? So the midterm exam is not on Thanksgiving because the building will be closed. It is in fact on the Wednesday after, so it'll be on the 16th. That's now on the syllabus. If that causes you any issues, let me know and maybe we can work around something. And then I redid the schedule for the labs because I had put them on Tuesdays and not Thursdays. So the lab schedule is now up here. So no lab, obviously yesterday, no lab next Thursday, but the Thursday after. So starting on September 19th, our lab's the 19th, the 26th, October 10th, and then, October 31st, Halloween. I won't, L'Oreal said she will come in dressed in her witch hat and bring candy on that day. So you can look forward to that. November 21st and November 21st. Interviews and mixed methods on the 28th. So that's the lab schedule. And then the two drop-in days, right, are the 17th and December 5th. Those are not mandatory. Well, I'm not taking attendance in any of the labs, right? You come, you're an adult, you decide what you want to attend. They are useful in terms of developing those skills and working with other people, and especially working with L'Oreal, and she's really good. The drop-ins are, just help if you need help. You can, with the labs, the big ones, you can go in and she will help you. She'll walk you through it. She'll give you some feedback on what you have. Okay. Any questions about that before I go into something else? All right. So I am eventually getting more organized. And I will say I've had already adventures with Canvas. Fun adventures. I was trying to import my questions for this class from last year for the midterms, and I struggled importing content from Moodle to Canvas, and I eventually got it. However, I then struggled for a further 3 hours because I knew I had the questions because I could click on the quizzes tab and it's like, okay, there are my questions. And I would go and create a new exam and it's like, you have no questions in your question bank. And I'm like, fuck. What's going on? So, I did eventually figure it out. Apparently, Canvas has two types of quizzes, the new quiz and the classic quiz. And the test banks are not interchangeable between the two. And when you import from Moodle, it imports, or eClass, it imports it into the classic quiz. And I was trying to create a new quiz. So this cost me, a good, solid half my work day yesterday trying to beat my head against the wall and figure this out. Do I have to input hundreds of multiple choice questions by hand? And I'm like, I really don't want to do that. But I figured it out. So already adventures in Canvas begin. Okay, so I wanted to show you, first off, just so you get a kind of start thinking about it, right? Because it's already up. It's due, as you can see, October 24th. This is the major lab, right? So these are the components, right? These 5 points. And if you click on that, it'll bring up a Word document that has those same 5 points because some people like to download it. That's what you have to do for the assignment. Go back, and now I'm on a different part of the page. Super duper. I'm sure there's a more sophisticated way for me to navigate that. The rubric for the major lab is here, right? So, that is basically how you'll be evaluated. This one is out of 40. The second one, the major lab number 2, I think is out of 43, because I like to mark you out of completely random numbers, so it's super easy to do the math, right? But yeah, that one will be up soon. I didn't quite have a chance to put it up, but that's not due till the end of the term. So you can have a look at this, right? But this is basically what you're being marked on. And as we get a little closer, we can, and it's a little bit more meaningful, we can go through what this looks like. But it's a pretty straightforward assignment and all of that. That take me to, oh, there's just a second page. Okay. And if I close that, it goes back to this page. So that is already up. So if you want to take a look at it and sort of start thinking about what this is going to look like, it's already there. One thing I will say, I've restricted the files to docs format and PDF, because occasionally people will upload a .pages document from the terrible word processor that comes with your Mac. And I can technically handle this, but I have a PC, so no program on the PC will ever open a .pages document. So I can handle it by going to my wife's iCloud account, importing it, and then exporting it, but it's a giant pain in the butt. So you now just can't do it. So if you use Pages or Google Docs, please, those are the two formats that you can export it into. All right, but that's not for a while, right? That's not till end of October, but it's all there for you to start thinking about, hopefully not fretting about, thinking about. I'll talk a little bit more about it when I get there. Some of those word counts are a little bit flexible too, but we'll deal with that when we get there. Or as my dad likes to say, we'll blow up that bridge when we get to it, which I don't think is actually the correct expression, but I like it better. Any questions about any of this before I kind of jump into lectures? So I just want to put it up there so you get as much advanced warning on it as humanly possible. And obviously, the mini lab assignments are there, but you'll be doing those after. Whoa, see, there's the test banks. Could I find them later? No. The mini labs are also that. You can't see those. They're unpublished. Sorry, you can't go through my test banks. I checked. I did the student view to see what would come up for you, and the test banks are invisible, so it's all good. Each of the mini labs are going to look kind of like this and be marked out of 10. So that's the first one, but you don't have to worry about that until September 22nd when it is due. So no worries there. All right. Now, okay, just this, a little out of order today. I've put in this kind of communication system. I know not everybody loves raising their hand to ask questions. So this is an alternative. Basically, if you want to ask questions, but you're too shy to raise your hand and talk, or if you want to warn me that I've done something super silly, you can basically go to slido.com, enter this code, or scan this on your phone, and it takes you to like a Q&A page. And every now and then, one of these comes up, and if there's a question, it just kind of shows up there, and I'll answer them in course. All right, who's ready to learn some social methods? Are you all as excited as I am? Yes? Do we need like a pump-up song or something? Some Taylor Swift? I don't know. My daughter decided she loves Taylor Swift over the summer, and now I'm sadly roped into it. Okay, so we're going to talk social research and kind of move towards, in this first unit, the idea of you sort of developing your research, your potential research project, your proposal, right, your major lab number 1, which is going to start with, developing sort of a topic area, a research focus, and a research question, something that you could, potentially actually investigate. Okay, but before we even get there, we need to talk some basics about doing social research. Now, a lot of research in sociology, like we have 2 major camps, right? So we have our, quantitative and qualitative. we'll talk about them each in kind of their own turn. They have slightly different approaches to questions about how to develop research questions, how to implement theories, and the like, right? And they have different sorts of understandings of what the social world looks like and how it's therefore appropriate to research it. Okay, most of the time though, when we start doing research, right, most people are going to start at least on some level with a theory. Now for quant and qual, this means slightly different things. Again, we'll get to that as we go through, but basically, you can essentially have two kinds of positions. So your theory can guide the sort of research that you do, right? So you might have a theory that sort of directs how you do the research, often the lens through which you're seeing the data, right? When we're talking about kind of grand theories, or, especially when you're talking about quantitative research, research can actually be in service of testing a theory about a particular social phenomenon. Okay, hopefully, don't worry, if you're like, I don't know what you're talking about, it's clear as mud so far, it'll get better. All right, so what's a theory kind of in general terms, right? A theory is just an explanation of regularities or patterns, right? Something that you would basically say, this theory explains the patterns that we see in society repeating over and over again. Like whether it's at the macro level or within kind of subcultures and subgroups, a theory is there to sort of explain those regularities, right? So now if you think theory sounds very scientific, that's right? A lot of what sociology does, right, as a social science, and psychology as a social science as well, is based on a kind of assumption, in large part, that you can understand the world in a scientific way, that you can do science, the science of society, or you can do scientific research on human societies and come up with theories, that are like a scientific theory. Okay, so what do you have within a theory? Well, almost always theories will have some kind of definition, right? Key terms, things that they're talking about, ways that they understand particular concepts and ideas, descriptions of the characteristics of what they are studying or the social phenomenon that they are describing. Relational statements, right? Especially when we're dealing with quant, right? With quant, relational statements as to how variables are related, right? So, as what's the classic example? As the temperature increases, as ice cream sales increase, murders increase as well, right? So ice cream sales cause murder. No, that's a classic fallacy, but something like that, right? Or, as people get richer, they get happier, right? Those would be kind of a relational statement between variables, right? Wealth and happiness. So, theories often will tell you what the relationship between different variables is. And then they can either be deterministic in that they, make the claim that they are telling you with, a large degree of certainty that they are correct and that the relationship, say, between variables is pretty ironclad, or probabilistic in that it's more likely than not that this is the relationship between variables or that this is the explanation for this social phenomenon that we're seeing, right? So deterministic is pretty hard, right? Pretty locked down. We think it's a very, very strong explanation. And probabilistic, can be like better than 50% chance, right? So those are the kinds of things that we typically have in theories, right? They'll either make really strong statements that are very certain or statements that are a little bit more like, the bulk of the evidence suggests that, or it's highly probable that this is the relationship. Okay, how are we doing so far? I know it's a little vague, but we'll put some shoe leather on it as we go through. All right. Generally speaking, in social research, you could come to kind of two different kinds of theories. Now, for most of us, right, we're never going to get here. Most of the work in social science, in sociology, is in this. It's in middle range theories. So I'll explain them backwards to what I have on the slide. Grand theories are, like when you go through SOC 100 and you go through a particular topic or through the whole textbook, and it's like, this is the theory that sort of explains everything. It's sort of like what you would call maybe a grand theory or a meta theory, right? That explains sort of the whole structure of society. So you can think here, right, if you've all taken SOC 100, so you had in SOC 100, right, your three kind of big theories that everybody has to talk about. All my philosophy friends joke about this, and they call it SOC 100 the Marx, Durkheim, Weber course, right? Because it's like Marx, Durkheim, Weber, Marx, Durkheim, Weber, right? But our grand theories in sociology tend to be, Marxism, or, if you want to couch it in more polite language, conflict theory, right? Structural functionalism and symbolic interactionism, right? Those are grand theories, right? They're supposed to explain not just particular phenomenons, but the whole structure of kind of society, right? So think of like the Marxist account, right? That everything in society is all down to class conflict, right? That's a grand theory kind of claim, right? That all social relationships are structured through class conflicts of some kind. And later critical theories, right, will look at it through, maybe race or patriarchy, but same kind of thing, right? That all social forces are kind of structured through these relationships. Functionalism obviously is a little bit different. I won't go through the three schools of sociology again, but functionalism, right, basically says all human beings are kind of in this constant interaction with structures that basically shape their experiences. Those structures have functions, and those structures shape human experience in particular ways. So those are all grand theories, right? Now, unless your name is like Durkheim or Michel Foucault, the chance that, and maybe you're brilliant, I don't want to like diminish you and squash your dreams before you even start your research career. Most people never get here. I'm certainly never going, I almost guarantee, I've come to this, my humility has kicked in at some point in my 30s, I think. I'm never going to get to the status of a grand theoretician, right? Any of the research I ever do is always going to be at this level, which is middle range theories. And that's okay, right? One person, because I'm not a great, huge fan of Foucault, and one of my friends who's not an academic was like, well, why don't you like write a whole bunch of stuff disproving Foucault? And I'm like, you know what? I'm just not that ambitious. That's me, and I'm not that smart either. So, middle range theories are where most of us live all of the time, right? Where they're limited in scope, and they tend to describe particular, like either single, so one, or small groups. I put like 5. It could be more than 5. Small groups of social phenomena, right? So rather than like explaining the whole of society, or like Marx, the whole swath of history being about class conflict, middle range theories are, we want to explain, the youth mental health crisis, right? So, I mean, if you took sociology or youth with me, or if you've kind of been paying attention to, say, Jonathan Haidt, and Jean Twenge, they've written books about the youth mental health crisis and how it's related to smartphones and social media, right? That would sit very specifically in middle range theory. And this can be like I thought that was a hand up, you scared me. You're like, fixing your hair, all good. No, I'm not scared of questions. It just surprised me for a sec. I was on my thing about middle range theories. Yeah, so I mean, why, cell phone and social media use being related to youth mental health problems would be a middle range theory. Or someone, say, in media studies, saying that, the production of X kind of, this kind of video content in China is related to this kind of force that comes from globalization, right? Those would be middle range theories because they seek to explain sort of limited phenomena. They're generally pretty testable, right? You can generally, especially on the quantitative side, test them or sort of, look for evidence to support that specific interpretation. Grand theories are a lot less testable, right? So, generally grand theories are kind of broad frameworks of thinking, and middle range theories are specific explanations about social phenomena. And like I said, when you're writing your research proposals, aim for a middle, like what you would come out of at the end with the creation of a middle range theory, right? An explanation of a particular social phenomenon. Does following the Kardashians on Instagram make you a bad person? The answer is yes, of course. So aim for that. Don't try to do a grand theory. I had one friend, he was a master's student when I was doing my PhD, and his master's proposal was cuckoo pants, and he was aiming at grand theory, right? He was going to explain, capitalism's link to climate change during the Anthropocene, and it was like absolutely cuckoo pants. Like smart, super smart guy, really, really smart guy. He never finished. He dropped out of his master's because he could never develop a grand theory on that scale. So definitely don't, for your kind of project in this class, aim to just explain a single or a small group of social phenomena and come up with a middle range theory. Okay, how are we doing? Do I have a question slide? No questions. Are we? Everyone's here. Are we all doing okay with this? Do you like my doodles? I just love doodling on the screen. I don't know why. This makes me happy. It makes me feel like I'm doing something. While I lecture, it's like circle, arrow. I don't know if they're useful, but I sure like it. Okay. Now, there's broadly, when we talk about social science research, and again, we're splitting it between quantitative for deductive and qualitative for inductive, typically, right? So we generally have two sorts of ways of going, methods in a sense, for getting at, I should kind of, approaches, because methods, we'll save method for a different thing for specific ways of getting data. But basically, you can approach trying to create a theory either deductively, right? So using a deduction or a deductive method, or inductively, right? So deductive tends to be more quantitative in nature, and inductive tends to be more qualitative. Now, they're related to different ways of understanding the social world and how well we can measure things in the social world. But basically, deductive methodologies, right? So typical of quantitative research, and especially like survey research, which is the most used social method of all. Basically, the idea is you sort of, and you can see it from my little graph here, you start with a theory, right? So you start with a theory, and basically an idea, right? This is what you think is happening, right? So you think that, social media use by 9 to 16-year-olds is leading to the youth mental health crisis, right? So that'd be a nice middle range theory that you're starting from. All right, you do some background research, so you see if anyone else has done any research on it, and you acquire that, right? That's typically the lit review part or literature review part of your master's or PhD. And I guess there's always a kind of there's two ways that this can go. Either you find a bunch of research that people have done, and then you kind of find something they're not addressing and add to it, or if you find that no one has done any research on it, either you have come across a whole new field and you're going to make your name on it, or alternatively, this can also happen, the question you're asking is so stupid that it's not worth answering. Because sometimes no one has written on something because it's a dumb question, right? Or you're so far out in left field. And you kind of have to determine that. My PhD supervisor always said, if you think you've discovered something so completely innovative that no one has ever thought about it, and you start reveling in your own genius, stop. Because you might be wandering into a position where you're going to write a dissertation so completely insane and useless that A, you will fail, and B, you'll be laughed out of the academy and you'll have wasted all your time. And I know that that sounds improbable, but I do actually know someone who 100% did this, and it was the craziest. Like, I'm going to disprove the theory of evolution using Marshall McLuhan's theory of media extension. And I have a copy of his dissertation, and it's the no, you're looking at me like, what the hell is this person on? I tried to warn him, but it was just like hitting my head up against the wall. So eventually I just gave up. I'm like, you know what you're saying makes absolutely no sense. You're both misinterpreting like evolution and Marshall McLuhan, right? And he's like, no, it's brilliant. I'm like, sure. He works at Walmart now, by the way. So that's a thing. He's a manager though, so it's good. I joke. There's nothing wrong with being a manager at Walmart. That's all good. But he was thinking that he would create whole new schools of thought, and he ended up as a manager at Walmart. So it's fine. Don't try to disprove evolution with Marshall McLuhan. It doesn't work. I can tell you this. Okay, so right, understand the phenomenon through what other people have done. And again, if you feel like you've geniusly wandered into a space no one has ever wandered, sometimes that's a desert, and you should probably best to turn back before you die. Okay, you develop a hypothesis, right? Something that you can test, right? Which is going to involve, things like operationalizing your research question or your theory, right? Well, don't worry. We're going to talk about operationalization in so much detail, you're going to feel like, it's your best friend, because operationalization is one of the hardest parts of coming up with a quantitative research question. But, in developing a hypothesis, you have to figure out what things you could possibly measure and then come up with your prediction of what the relationship between those things is going to be, right? So you might theorize that, the more hours a teenager spends on social media, the more likely they are to be depressed or lonely or anxious or whatever, right? Okay, so you develop your hypothesis, and then what do? Then you go get data, right? So you go and you collect, you probably do a survey or you do some kind of, maybe structured observation, but you go and get, or ethnography or something, you go get data, right? Actually, ethnography is more of a qualitative. So let's stick with surveys for this example. You go and you conduct a survey of teenagers and you ask them a bunch of questions about what they do on their smartphones, how many hours they spend, what apps they use, how much they spend on TikTok, Instagram, all that stuff. And then, you ask them, I don't know, using like the UCLA loneliness scale, how lonely they are, how anxious they are, all of that fun stuff. And then, you take that data, you run it through all the fancy schmancy statistical methods you all learned in SOC 210 and probably remember and are super comfortable with. We're just gonna go with that. And again, don't worry, I'm not gonna make you do stats in this class. And you test your hypothesis, and sometimes you have to revise, because like in the example I just gave you, most studies of teenagers and smartphones don't find a particularly strong correlation between hours spent and depression, right? It's not super clear that the more time you spend on your smartphone, the more depressed you are. So you might have to revise this, maybe you think of another factor, something else that might be causing the youth mental health crisis, some other way that phones are related to it, something like that. And so you would revise your hypothesis, and if you have to, if you proved your hypothesis and you're right, you go write the paper and you move on to become a famous academic. If you need to revise, right, you go back, you revise your hypothesis, you test it again, and you kind of keep going from there. So I guess I could have said this much more simply. Deductive methods are typically theory to data, right? So that's the direction of it. You start with the theory, and then you move to the data. Okay. But then if I had just said that, I couldn't have told you my charming anecdote about my friend Greg. Okay. So, right, again, this is just from the textbook, right? Theory, stage one, hypothesis two, data collection, findings, you analyze them here, confirms or rejects your hypothesis, and, if it's confirmed, write that paper. If it's rejected, right, you revise your theory and you go back to hypothesis and data collection. So that's the way it goes. Okay, inductive approaches, right? So as you can see here on my little color chart that I stole from the internet, which I did not make. Basically, when you're doing inductive research, so again, this is typically qualitative, right? So it involves much more interpretation. I'll just put qualitative. Inductive methods are usually kind of the inverse pattern, right? So you typically with inductive methods, you start with data collection, and then you develop the theory as you analyze the data that you are getting, right? So inductive methods, you typically might have, a sort of a research question and a sort of vague idea of what you might find, but you're not coming up with a hypothesis right off the start, right? So you start with data collection, and then you move to the development of your explanation, right? So so the way this works, right, is basically, right, is you collect the data, you look for patterns, right? So you find patterns. You're like, oh, in, I don't know, let's say interviews that you did with incarcerated persons, you found that, the bulk of them related some kind of poverty, right? Low socioeconomic status in their youth as contributing to their eventual incarceration. So you spot a pattern in the interviews you're doing. Many of your participants are talking about having grown up poor, right? So from that, you build, your hypothesis, right? Your potential explanation. And then what you typically do is you go and you collect more data. So we often think of inductive methodologies as much more iterative, right? So they go kind of in stages, right? Where it's like, collect data, come up with a hypothesis. Okay, now I have a hypothesis. Now I'm going to go collect more data, where you're testing your hypothesis through, getting more data. This is from a medical perspective, obviously. Treat your patient. If he dies, you were wrong. That's a pretty terrible example, but that's the show House in a nutshell. But in social research, it's much more like step, right? Okay, I tested I got some data, came up with what I think is an explanation, and then I went and interviewed some more people, and okay, I found some correlation, but I also found these other factors, so I expanded my theory to include those as well, right? So now my theory includes, poverty and poor social relations with my parents, right? And you kind of expand it until basically you feel like you've explained everything you're finding in your data set. So it tends to be very iterative. Okay. Create theory from the observation. Yeah. Well, the most common of these, and we'll talk about this throughout the course, the most common qualitative kind of overall framework is what's called grounded theory. And all grounded theory is the idea that whatever theory you come up with at the end of the day is grounded in your data, right? So that, as you create your theory or your explanations, it's grounded from, rather than, having started with a theory and then looking for data to prove it, your theory is grounded in data you already have, right? So you derive your theory through observation. So almost any time that you are doing, qualitative research, you're doing some form of grounded theory, whether it's acknowledged or not, right? But yeah, it's almost always grounded in information that you are collecting, rather than testing a hypothesis from a theory that you already had to start. Okay, is that so far clear? Yeah, okay, perfect. So yeah, I mean, as you see, kind of what I was saying, deductive approaches, they are theory to observations and findings, and then, basically, so to your data. And inductive approaches are data first, theory after. Okay. So, each of these sorts of like broad categories, right? Quantitative and qualitative, also typically come with, a couple of things, what are called epistemology and ontology, right? And they have these sort of explicit assumptions. Now, for you, even if you're starting out your kind of career as a researcher, you probably don't need to spell out in your kind of research proposal, that I am starting from a positivist epistemology. But just to know that, these different streams of social research have very different assumptions about the world, and they fight about them all the time, right? There's a lot of snarky battles in social science between quantitative and qualitative researchers. It matters, but also because researchers are petty and really like to shit talk each other all the time. And quantitative researchers will often have big pretensions, like I'll show you, to how scientific their work is. And qualitative researchers will often have a lot of, pretension as to how grounded their work is and all of these sorts of things. And it comes down to these questions about epistemology and ontology. Right, okay, so what is epistemology, right? Epistemology is a fancy Greek word for how we know what we know, right? How do we know the world, and how can you legitimately acquire knowledge about the world? And in this case, obviously, we're talking about the social world, right? So this is a question like, if you want to study a social phenomenon or study society, how can you gain knowledge about society validly? Like, what is the best way? And okay, there are kind of three typical approaches: positivism, interpretivism, and sort of critical or Marxist approaches to it. Okay, so positivism. So positivism basically finds its roots in the fact that, sociology and the other social sciences think of themselves as sciences, in a lot of ways no less valid or capable of discovering things about the world as the natural sciences, right? So, I guess at the core of positivism is do I have this on another slide? No. At the core of positivism is the assumption that the social world exists and it can be measured. Okay, that's more of an ontological question, but it kind of goes together. Okay, so positivism basically follows the natural sciences and the idea of empiricism, the idea that you can measure things, and through some kind of measurement, right? So using the senses or using tools, you can measure things, and you can, through those measurements, know something about the social world at the end of the day. That there's kind of a real world there to measure, and that social phenomenon are inherently measurable, right? So anytime you do a survey, right? So, you're doing a survey, the university is asking you to do a survey, or you get a call from a pollster doing a survey, what you're essentially running into there is a sort of positivist epistemology, right? A positivist understanding of how we can gain valid data, because the assumption is we can measure stuff, right? We can measure some kind of social phenomenon. You can measure political opinions. You can measure, social attitudes about any number of social phenomenon, right? Poverty, taxes, whether people still like Justin Trudeau. They don't. The polls are disastrous. Okay, all sorts of things like that. So you can measure things, right, empirically, right? So you can be relatively unbiased in your measurements if you have the right tools, right? So, and from that you can generate hypotheses to test using deduction. Potentially, like, not all quantitative research is necessarily deductive. There can be some inductive stuff as well, and some of these distinctions that I'm making are a little bit less clear once you actually get out in the real world. But for the moment, let's just pretend that they're very black and white because it helps to sort of understand them. Sometimes, in positivist or quantitative research, you can do this kind of iterative thing in terms of induction as well. But we'll talk about that later. One of the core values in positivism is that science, social science included, is sort of value-free, right? We're just measuring stuff, right? We're just measuring stuff. When we're doing surveys, we're just measuring stuff. It's value-free in that sense. People used to refer to this in kind of social sciences as objectivity. Increasingly, the term that's sort of been tossed around is intersubjectivity. The idea being that, if you have more than one person looking at the same data, they should basically get the same results, right? So from the position of 2 different subjects or 10 different subjects or 100 different subjects, everybody should be coming up with the same explanations. All right, and scientific statements for positivists are of key importance, right? That you come up with a theory at the end that basically explains the data and maintains this sort of objective or intersubjective sort of framework. Good? Questions? No? All right. I know, we're in the preliminaries. All right. Interpretivism is not that. Okay. So interpretivism, amongst other things, is a critique of positivism, and especially in the social sciences, is a sort of attempt to particularly look at the social world more through the eyes of the people who are involved, right? And to look more at their subjectivity, right? That there's the subjectivity of individuals within a society matters, right? Because they know their lives, they know what's going on, they can explain to you how their perceptions of the world shape their behaviors, right? So interpretivism really is about, rather than trying to measure objectively the social world, it is about trying to understand the social world from the perspective of the people living in it, right? The goal is to grasp the subjective meaning of people's lives, to see the world as people see it, or to get their interpretations, right? So again, this is typical of qualitative research, right? So when we're talking about positivism, right, we want to quantify things. We want to turn things into numbers, things that are measurable objectively, that we can put into numbers. 55% of people say X. That's a fairly objective kind of statement. Qualitative research is much more, quantitative research is interested in the quantity of things, of measuring things as quantities. Qualitative research is much more interested in people's perspectives or the qualities of people's experiences, right? So that's why you have this, that's why the terms are what they are. But yeah, qualitative or interpretivism, you want to get at the meaning that people ascribe in their own lives, right? It assumes, though, that there isn't necessarily a social world that is measurable, right? That basically there isn't something that like just a social world out there that if you can collect enough data on it, you're going to understand it. But that instead, all there is people's interpretations of the world as they see it. So the goal of this kind of research is to try and get as rich an account of how people understand their world, rather than a hard quantitative sort of understanding of it, right? Like 55% of people think Justin Trudeau is the worst prime minister in Canadian history, right? This would be more interested in why are people interpreting this particular person in this particular way? How are they perceiving him? How are they perceiving the society that they're living in and his relation to it, right? So you're much more interested in people's interpretations and their explanations of their own lives, right? So again, this views the world from the point of view of the people in it, right? The social actors, right? So if you want to find out about, what it's like to be an incarcerated person, right? What do? You don't measure how many people are incarcerated and how many meals they get per day and how many hours of rec time they have. From the interpretivist position, right, you would talk to people who are incarcerated, ask them what their lives are like, what it's like to be an incarcerated person, right? So you try to, understand their experiences by listening to them, or experiencing it with them in the case of ethnographies, and understand their interpretations of their existence. Okay, how much time do I have left? 4 minutes. 4 minutes. Okay. Yeah, one of the major kind of schools here when we talk about your three major sociological schools is symbolic interactionism, right? So basically this idea that people ascribe certain meanings to things in society comes out of this interpretivist framework. So again, if you remember back to your kind of intro SOC classes where you're talking about interactionism is a interpretivist school, right? Because it's interested in how people construct meaning out of their lives. Okay. Do I have time for critical approach? I can do critical approaches. We'll do this one and then we'll sort of leave it at that. Okay. Critical approaches to social science, right? So what I would say is, this is Marxist or conflict theory, Marxism, or critical theory, conflict theory, rather. Critical approaches to social science, too, are a critique of positivism, but more typically, a kind of critical theory sort of criticism of, say, empiricism, or positivism, rather, is that positivism and its pretenses to science hides all the ideologies that are, hidden inside science, right? That the person doing the science is part of a power structure, and that ultimately, can shape their interpretation, often in the direction of the elites, because most people doing research are, sort of in the elite caste. Yeah, so critical researchers, it's not really, they can do kind of deductive or inductive research, quantitative or qualitative, but one of the things that they typically reject is that any research is value-free, right? That basically all research, even the questions you're asking, come with a set of implicit social values. And one of the key things, that critical theory typically stresses is anti-oppressive practices and its anti-oppressive political nature, right? So they basically want to look at power dynamics and to break those down, especially along the lines of oppressors and oppressed, in whatever kind of permutation you have. And conflict or critical kind of approaches almost always involve praxis, right? Putting the theoretical perspectives or positions into practice, typically to bring about some kind of social change. So a lot of times, one of the critiques that critical theorists would have of, say, positivist research is that it's like you are just making scientific statements, but then you don't go out and do anything about it. And for critical approaches to social science, they want some kind of political action to come out of research, saying, right, if you're discovering, say, inequalities or oppressions and you don't do anything about it, then you're ultimately kind of failing. So sometimes, this gets called sort of activist research. And it can be, certainly. But typically, there's some kind of action that they want taken. And often, when we get into certain kinds of quantitative research, they may actually participate actively, with the groups they're in, especially in anti-kind of oppressive activities, right? So much less, they don't care about being objective as much. It's much more about, breaking down whatever oppressive systems they see. Okay. We'll start with ontology on Monday. That goes quick. An hour is a very short class, or 50 minutes is a very short class. Okay, we will see you on Monday. Have a great weekend.